The hot coffee splashed straight onto Julia's arm, burning sharp before sliding down to the tile floor like a streak of gasoline spilled wide open, and Frank Dalton simply smiled. Maybe if you weren't so clumsy. His voice hissed through Riverbend Grill, cutting the crowded little diner into stunned silence. Julia stood there at 33, trembling like a leaf torn from a branch, not because of the pain, but because of the humiliation, because she knew she could not afford to lose another job. In Riverbend, Ohio, a small town where opportunities were as scarce as winter, sunlight people like her were not allowed to fall apart. She pressed her wet hands against her apron, the burning still seeping into her skin. But what tightened her chest was the look from the customers, a mix of pity and judgment. Yet not a single person stood up. Not one voice spoke for her. So Julia turned away and rushed into the kitchen, back against the cold brick wall, as she tried to swallow the sob building in her throat. In her head echoed the voice of her son's teacher. Spencer still owes $23 for lunch. Another debt, another thing she could not manage. Tears spilled out hot and salty, merging with the familiar scent of grease and smoke wrapping around her, like a reminder that life was squeezing the breath out of her. And then she heard footsteps. At the far corner of the diner, the man in the faded jeans and worn shirt had not moved at all. Daniel Hayes, though, no one, not even Julia, knew his name. He had seen the entire scene carve through the room like a blade, cutting into an old memory he had buried, deep the memory of his mother being humiliated in front of him when he was a poor 10-year-old boy. Dan's heart clenched when he saw Julia wipe her tears, looking exactly like his mother once had, small, struggling, and completely alone. Outside the kitchen, Frank barked again. "Hurry up, I have been waiting!" His voice boomed, carrying that hollow authority men like him always believed they deserved. Dan closed his eyes for a moment. In that brief second, his mind moved like electricity, racing through a circuit. He no longer heard the clinking of silverware or the traffic outside or the rain tapping against the awning. All he heard was Julia's heartbeat, frantic with fear. All he saw was her shoulders trembling as she lifted the coffee pot again. And inside him rose a feeling he had avoided for years, the anger of someone who once knew pain, and the resolve of someone who would never let history repeat itself. Julia stepped out of the kitchen, her hand still red from the burn, her eyes still shimmering with tears not fully dry. She held the coffee pot the way she held her son's next meal, shaking but determined. Each step felt like walking along the edge of a cliff. Frank saw her and waved impatiently. "Finally, and try not to mess it up this time." Julia inhaled deeply, lifted the coffee pot, and Dan's hand suddenly pressed gently against the rim of the cup. Enough. One word short and sharp, but the entire diner seemed to explode into silence. Julia startled. Frank froze, then lifted one eyebrow with a mocking smirk. "And your customers turned." Spoons stopped clinking. Something invisible tightened the room. Dan straightened his gaze, unwavering his voice, low and cold enough to make the man at the next table shiver. "I am the person who has watched you treat her like trash for weeks." Julia's heart pounded. Her throat locked. She wanted to say, wanted to say, "Please don't do this because of me," but she could not force a single word out. Frank laughed loud and bloated, with the fake power of a man who lived off belittling others. "So what, she's sloppy. If she can't handle the job," Dan cut him off. His voice was not loud, but it was sharp as a blade. "You don't get to judge anyone's ability, not when you can't even judge yourself." The air shifted. Frank shot up from his seat, the chair screeching across the floor. "You don't talk to me like that." Dan stepped forward half a pace, his face unmoving, his eyes steady and unreadable. "I am saying it because no one has ever told you the truth." 1 second. 2. Then Frank threw a few crumpled bills on the table, muttered a curse, and stormed out. The door slammed so hard it rattled. Only then did Julia feel her knees weaken. She clutched the coffee pot, her lips trembling. Dan turned toward her, and his eyes did not hold pity, but something she hadn't seen in years, respect. "You don't deserve that," he said softly. Just 4 words, but they made Julia want to cry again, not from humiliation, but because, for the first time in so long, someone truly saw her, and she had no idea that the man standing in front of her was about to change her entire life, all because of this moment, all because of a small act of kindness, powerful enough to open a future she had never dared to dream. Julia stood frozen in front of Dan, her breath still tinged with fear, her hands shaking so badly she had to grip the handle of the coffee pot just to steady herself. The burn on her skin still stung, but that pain was nothing compared to the storm twisting inside her chest. Gratitude, confusion, worry, fear, all colliding like a never-ending whirlpool. Dan watched her for a long moment, his eyes neither imposing nor pitying, only quietly understanding, making her feel for the first time in a long while that she was no longer invisible. After a pause, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "Julia, you do not have to serve people who treat you like trash." She pressed her lips together, trying to smile, but the smile broke apart like a cracked mirror. I need this job." Just 1 sentence, but it carried her entire world. The electric bill, the school lunches, Spencer's worn-out shoes, the water bill, the rent due in 4 days. Dan nodded, as if he understood everything she didn't say. "Can you sit for a moment?" Julia glanced toward the kitchen, where Tony, the owner and head cook, pretended not to listen, but kept watching them. He gave her a small nod, his worried eyes silently granting her a moment's rest. Julia set the coffee pot down, took a deep breath, and sat in the chair across from Dan. The sounds of the diner, the clatter of knives against cutting boards, the chatter of customers all faded into a soft blur as Dan spoke slowly. "I am sorry." Julia blinked. "For what?" "For sitting here for 3 weeks, watching him do that to you, and only today, standing up." Julia opened her mouth to insist he had no obligation to protect her, but Dan continued, his voice heavy with regret. "No one deserves to be treated that way, especially someone who works as hard as you." For the first time in months, someone recognized her effort without a complaint attached to it. Julia looked down at her calloused hands. "You talk like you have known me for a long time." Dan paused for a single breath, then reached into his pocket and placed a business card on the table. Julia looked at it, her eyes widening, her heart stumbling. "Daniel Hayes, Chief Executive Officer, Hayes Hospitality Group." She froze, her breath caught in her chest. The simple man in front of her, the one who drank black coffee every day, who drove an old pickup truck, who spoke gently, like any working man, was actually the CEO of a corporation that bought and rebuilt restaurants across America. No way," Julia whispered. "You see it now," Dan said with a quiet smile that held no arrogance. "I came here because I needed to understand this place before deciding whether to buy it." Julia swallowed hard, the world tilting beneath her. You plan to buy Riverbend Grill. I plan to," Dan corrected. but not just because of revenue. He looked into her eyes, and the intensity of his gaze made her look away, overwhelmed. I have watched you, Julia. The way you remember every customer's name, the way you smile even at people who do not deserve it, the way you used your own tips to cover that elderly lady's meal last week. I see everything. Tears rose in Julia's eyes. Why? Why were you watching me? Dan leaned back, his hands clasping together. Because I grew up in a family where my mother was treated the same way you were. She worked in a small diner like this. She was insulted every day, and I swore that if I ever had the power, I would change the culture of places like this. Julia's heart twisted. Her own memories surged forward, the days she stood in job lines after the factory where she had worked for 6 years, shut down the nights she fell asleep on her arm in the bathroom, so Spencer would not see her cry, the times she believed she had no future left. Dan continued, his voice dropping lower. Julia, a restaurant does not stand because of its menu or its lighting. It stands because of its people. And you, the way you live, the way you work, show me the true value of this place. Julia exhaled shakily, a strange feeling spreading in her chest, something like hope, mixed with fear, like a door opening that she was not sure she was ready to step through. But I am not special. Dan shook his head instantly. No, you are special in the ways people overlook, in your kindness, your dedication, the way you still stand, even when life keeps knocking you down. That cannot be taught. Julia looked down at her old shoes, her throat tightening. At that moment, Tony peeked out from the kitchen, pretending to ask, "You okay, Julia?" She nodded faintly, but her eyes remained on Dan, as if he held the answer to a question she had buried for years. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Dan did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed his hand on the table and leaned in slightly. "I want the truth," he said. "I want to know everything that happens here, who is being overworked, who is being mistreated, what this place is missing and what deserves to be saved." Julia fell silent for a long, long time. Then she whispered, as though confessing something fragile, "Riverbend Grill is dying, and no one knows except the people working inside it." Dan nodded his eyes, confirming that he had suspected as much. "I want to hear that story from your own mouth." Julia looked toward the window where raindrops had begun to fall onto the sidewalk, coating the town in a soft, melancholy glow. And in that moment, for the first time in months, she felt she no longer had to fight alone. She felt the strange certainty that this humiliating night might actually be the beginning of something bigger, something better, something she never thought could happen. Something she had never dared dream, but that now felt close. Very close. Dan looked at her and said firmly, "Julia, I want to change this place, but I cannot do it without you." And Julia felt her heart skip a beat. She did not yet know that those simple, powerful words were about to change not only her fate, but the fate of the entire Riverbend community forever. The night wind brushed against the front windows of Riverbend Grill, carrying the scent of damp soil and the last traces of rain. Yet inside the diner, Julia felt as if she were sitting in the center of her own private storm, a storm whose eye was the man across from her. Daniel Hayes with a calm and unreadable gaze. No passing cars, no clatter of kitchen utensils, no murmur of customers could pull her out of this strange moment. Every sound seemed to fade until all she could hear was her own shaky breath echoing in her mind. Dan studied her for a long time, as if he were measuring something important, not by the numbers on a report, but by something far more delicate, the truth of who she was. "Julia," he said, his voice deep, yet gentle, as though he feared startling her. "Have you ever thought that you deserve more?" Julia let out a dry laugh, a sound caught halfway in her throat from exhaustion and hurt. "I have Spencer. I just need him to eat well and sleep warm. Everything else?" She hesitated, unable to finish, because the word deserve felt too distant, like a luxury life had never allowed her to touch. Dan shook his head, disagreeing. "No, Julia. You are thinking like someone who has to survive. I want you to think like someone who has a future." The words pierced straight into her heart like a sharp needle. Not painful at first, but enough to make her entire body numb. A future. When was the last time she let herself imagine one? When the factory where she worked for 6 years shut down. When Spencer kept receiving notices about overdue lunch fees. When she had to borrow $30 from a neighbor just to buy gas to get to work. Dan placed his hand on the table, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, each tap like a pulse, pushing a decision into form. "Do you know I have traveled across America for months, visiting dozens of restaurants before investing?" Julia shook her head, her eyes widening. She could hardly imagine the simple man in front of her speaking about multi-million-dollar projects. "Most of the places I visited had the same problem," Dan continued. "Bad management, toxic culture, employees treated like tools, customers treated like inconveniences." But here he paused for a moment. Julia felt her heartbeat tighten. "Here there is you." Julia exhaled slowly, but the breath was heavy like stone. "You do not know me well enough to say that." Dan looked straight at her. "I know that you come in earlier than everyone else 3 times a week. I know you give up your own tips for elderly customers when no one is watching. I know you called a taxi for that old woman because the rain was too heavy. I know you talk to people with real eyes, not a forced smile for the sake of routine." Julia lowered her head, unable to meet his gaze. She was not used to being praised, not used to being seen, not used to being treated as someone who mattered. Dan slowly placed a small stack of papers on the table. Not contracts, not financial reports, but notes written by his own hand, slanted letters neat but full of insight. "Julia, I came here to evaluate buying Riverbend Grill," Dan said clearly. "And I have made my decision." Julia lifted her head, her heart rising to her throat. "You are going to buy it, yes," Dan replied without hesitation. "But more importantly, I want to buy it with you." Julia froze. The air seemed to thicken. "With me?" "That is right." Dan clasped his hands together. "I want you to rebuild this place with me. Not as an employee, not as someone who follows orders, as a partner, as a leader." Julia closed her eyes, trying to make sense of what was happening. "Me, a leader, I am just." "You are not just anything," Dan cut in firm, but not harsh. "You are the only one here who understands what customers need, who knows how employees should be treated, who knows how to make a place feel like home, rather than a place people endure to earn a paycheck." Julia wanted to refuse, wanted to say she was not good enough, that she had no degree, no management experience. But when she opened her mouth, what came out was, I cannot quit my shift. I need the money. I cannot risk the only thing I have." Dan stayed quiet for a few seconds, then spoke in a tone soft as wind, yet firm as steel. "Julia, I am not asking you to risk anything. I am asking you to rise. The words made Julia tremble, a different kind of trembling, not fear, but awakening. Dan continued, "I want to rebuild this entire place, renovate it, repair it, retrain the staff, upgrade everything. I want to create a place where anyone in this town feels welcome. I want fair wages, better benefits, profit sharing. I want this diner to become the heart of Riverbend." Julia forgot to breathe. "And I want you," Dan said, meeting her eyes with a look that did not intimidate her, but lifted her to lead it. Julia felt herself snap back like someone pulled from a dream. "But I have Spencer. I cannot work night shifts. I cannot leave him alone." Dan smiled. "That is exactly why I need you. I want to build a place where people like you, single mothers, people life has beaten down, but who still stand, can work without sacrificing their families, flexible schedules, childcare support. I will not let life force you to choose between being a mother and earning a living." Amid everything so big, so bright, so impossible, Julia could only whisper one fragile question. Trembling like a thin thread, "Why me?" Dan leaned back, his smile gentle, yet carrying the weight of a truth. "Because any business can train skill. But someone with a heart like yours cannot be found by looking at resumes." The words hit Julia like a wave, as though the entire dining room was spinning around her. Every old wound, every failure, every moment she had been dismissed, every night she cried in the kitchen, suddenly felt different, no longer just pain, but proof that she had never given up. And Dan somehow saw that. "I cannot answer yet," Julia said softly, even though her heart was shouting a different answer. "I need time to think." Of course, Dan nodded. "But Julia, there is something I want you to know." He placed his warm hand on the cold wooden table. "Tonight is not an ending, because Frank hurt you. Tonight is a beginning, because you were finally seen." Julia said nothing more. She could not. The world inside her was shifting piece by piece, and she had no idea that in that very moment, one small choice would lead to changes, not only for herself, but for the entire town of Riverbend in the months ahead. But right now, she knew only one thing. After years of living like a shadow for the first time, she felt she had a real place in the world. And it all began on a rainy night filled with tears and a stranger who chose to stand up. The night drifted toward its end, as the dim neon lights above Riverbend Grill cast a soft glow across Julia's hands, making the calluses on her fingers stand out even more clearly. She rose from the table, excused herself, and returned to finish the rest of her shift, though inside her chest everything felt tangled like a bundle of wires quietly burning. Dan didn't stop her. He simply watched with the understanding of a man who knew she needed a moment alone to breathe, to gather the pieces of her life that he had just uncovered, gently yet powerfully. Julia stepped back into the kitchen, grabbed a cloth and began wiping a streak of oil from the counter, even though the surface was already clean. Her hands moved out of habit, while her mind drifted into a nameless space filled with memories the nights she collapsed onto a thin, ripped sofa, without the strength to shower, the times she counted every spare coin to buy enough groceries for the week, the countless moments she forced optimism into her voice so Spencer would not see the weight crushing her. But tonight was different. For the first time in a very long time, she was not only thinking about how to keep surviving. For the first time, she saw a path leading out of the loop of exhaustion, poverty, and harsh words. Yet because that new path seemed so bright, it frightened her. When Julia walked back out to the dining area with a small, unsure smile, Dan was still sitting there, his hand wrapped loosely around a half-full cup of coffee. His eyes no longer held the sharp intensity they had when confronting Frank, but something softer, something that felt like he was waiting for her not to persuade her, but to stand beside her. "Are you all right?" Dan asked gently, and Julia heard real concern in the question, not polite small talk. I have a lot to think about," she replied, trying to steady her voice. Dan nodded. "That is a good thing. Only someone who takes their future seriously feels that way." Julia sat down, her fingers tightening around the handle of her mug, as if to keep herself from falling apart. "If I say yes, everything will change. Not just for me. For Spencer, too. And I do not want to make a mistake." Dan set his cup down and leaned slightly toward her. "I know," he said. "And I am not asking you to carry an impossible responsibility. I am offering you an opportunity." Julia pressed her lips together, afraid any word she spoke would turn into tears. "Do you really think I can manage a restaurant?" Dan's lips curled into a small smile, the kind that carried confidence he had considered carefully. "Julia, I never make decisions based on emotion. I have seen how you read customers' needs before they speak. I have seen how you quietly support weaker staff members without being told. I have seen how you bring warmth to a place that has grown cold from exhaustion and pressure." He placed his hand on the table, close enough for her to feel the assurance in his voice. That is leadership. Even people who study management for years cannot have it without heart. Julia bit her lip. "But what if I fail?" Dan answered instantly without hesitation. "Then I will teach you to try again, as many times as it takes." Those words, simple and solid, struck her like a breath of warmth melting ice. No one in Julia's life had ever said as many times as it takes. She had always been the one who had to stand up on her own, take the weight on her shoulders, fight through everything, even when she was at her breaking point. Suddenly, thunder boomed outside long and low, making the windows tremble. Julia flinched, then let out a soft laugh at the strange coincidence, as if the sky itself had chosen to mark this moment as a turning point. Dan glanced toward the window for a moment, then returned his focus to her. "I do not want to buy Riverbend Grill just to turn it into another soulless chain. I want to turn it into a place where everyone in this town feels they belong." His voice lowered each word, firm with intention. "And I want you to be the face of that change." Julia trembled not from fear anymore, but from a feeling she had thought she lost forever: pride. Yet that pride was so new, so unfamiliar, it felt almost unreal. "I do not know if I am strong enough," she admitted softly. Dan looked at her with such warmth that she had to glance away. "Julia, you have been strong your entire life without anyone noticing. All I am doing is showing you what has always been there." The words hit every hidden wound inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. She lowered her head to hide her vulnerability, but Dan did not make her feel ashamed. He spoke slowly, giving her space to breathe. "I watched my mother fall apart because no one gave her a chance. I vowed that if I ever had the power to change someone's fate, I would never hesitate." Julia lifted her eyes, red but shining brighter than ever. "You want me to believe in myself the way you believe in me?" Dan shook his head. "No, I want you to believe even stronger than that." Outside, the rain began to fall harder, sliding down the glass like applause from the night sky for the choice Julia was about to make. She drew in a deep breath, her heart tangled between fear and hope. But one truth stood clear inside her. From the moment Frank splashed coffee onto her life, had been steering her toward this crossroads. A crossroads that Dan, with sincerity, faith, and a deeply understanding heart, had opened for her. Dan Julia whispered, her voice steadier this time. "I want to try." Dan laughed softly, full of pride. "No, you are not going to try. You are going to succeed." Julia took another breath, this one not to hold back tears, but to welcome what was coming. "But I will need your guidance." Dan nodded, his smile widening. "Julia, I have been waiting for you to say that." The diner lights reflected in Julia's eyes worn down by years of struggle, yet glowing now with a rare spark of hope. That night when the clock in Riverbend struck 10, as the rain fell harder and wind swept along the streets, Julia Morgan chose a path that could change the entire course of her life. And Dan Hayes knew he had finally found what he had searched across America, for a heart strong and beautiful enough to lead something new, kind and greater than any report or business plan. But Julia didn't yet know that this choice would soon light up the town of Riverbend in a way no one could have imagined. When the wall clock at Riverbend Grill struck 10:17, the restaurant was already closed, the warm yellow light spilling across the worn tile floor in trembling streaks, and Julia stood alone in the quiet space, feeling as if the entire world were shifting colors right before her eyes. The old wooden tables, the faded posters, the chairs that had held her exhausted body on countless nights, now seemed to look back at her with a different expression, no longer cold or indifferent, but as though they were waiting for something bigger. Dan stood near the door, one hand resting on his jacket, but he had not left. He watched Julia with the gaze of someone who understood exactly what moment she was standing, in the line between old and new, between enduring and rising, between surviving and truly living. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Dan asked, not because he doubted her, but because he wanted her to claim the decision for herself. Julia turned toward him, her brown hair tied in a rushed bun, with a few loose strands falling from sweat and tears. But her eyes were different. They were no longer filled with fear, like when Frank yelled at her, or with shame when she was humiliated in front of customers. Now they were steady and calm, and for the first time in months, she was no longer avoiding herself. "I am sure," Julia said, her voice soft but solid as stone. "I want to change my life, and I want Spencer to grow up seeing his mother not just survive, but live." Dan's smile was small, yet it carried the kind of warmth that made a person feel safe. "Then we begin," he said. They sat together in the room where only the hum of the ceiling fan and the gentle rain tapping against the window could be heard. Dan opened his bag, took out a neatly clipped folder, and placed it in front of Julia, as though setting down the foundation of a new home. "This is the transition proposal," Dan explained. "But before you worry, it is not some sign your soul away contract. It is just the roadmap for what we will build together." Julia touched the edge of the papers, her hand trembling slightly. She had never seen real business documents before, only electricity bills, late payment notices, and grocery discount flyers. What lay in front of her now was not just paperwork. It was proof that she deserved something more. "Why is my name in the plan?" Julia asked, her eyes fixed on the line that read, "General Manager Training Candidate Julia Morgan." "Because I want you to have the position you deserve," Dan said. "Not out of pity. Not because you are struggling, but because you are talented in ways the world never learned to measure." Julia's throat tightened. "You believe in me that much? I believe in people who fight not for themselves, but for the ones they love," Dan said. You do everything for Spencer. That makes you a real leader." Julia let out a tearful laugh. "I am just a waitress." "No," Dan answered firmer this time. "You are the one who will change this place." At that moment, the kitchen door creaked open and Tony poked his head out. "I heard something about change," he asked, his voice mixed with curiosity and hope. Julia and Dan both smiled. Dan stood and walked toward Tony. "You kept Riverbend Grill alive for more than 25 years, Dan said. "I do not want to replace you. I want to partner with you." Tony stared, stunned. I thought you were planning to buy it and tear the place down or something." Dan shook his head. "No. This is your home. I only want to help it become the best version of itself." Tony fell silent. He looked at Julia, the young woman he had treated like a daughter, but had never been able to help beyond offering extra hours or small cash advances. When he realized she was not being left behind, but lifted up his eyes, grew red. "If she stays with you," Tony whispered, voice thick, "then I trust you." Julia looked at the two men standing before her, one who had protected her quietly for years, and one who had entered her life only weeks ago, yet somehow saw the value in her she thought had long disappeared. "Tomorrow," Dan said, "we begin. For now, keep everything quiet until I finish the purchase of Riverbend Grill." "So what do I need to do now?" Julia asked. "Go home. Sleep. Rest," Dan answered, decisive as a command. "Tomorrow you start your management training." Julia laughed, genuinely this time. "You say that so easily. Spencer is probably still awake, waiting for me." Dan looked at her a little longer than usual. "Spencer is very lucky," he said softly. "He has a mother who fights for him every single day." That made Julia turn away to hide the new tear sliding down her cheek. She gathered her things, put on her coat, and when she stood at the door, she looked back at Riverbend Grill one last time that night. The old tables, the tired walls, the scratched kitchen tools, all the things that once felt like chains. But tonight she saw something different, as if the dusty film on the window had finally been wiped away, revealing a future she had never dared to imagine. A restaurant glowing with light, filled with laughter, filled with hope, and carrying her name within it. Julia, Dan called. She turned back. "Tomorrow," he said with a wide and certain smile, "your life turns the page." Julia did not answer. She did not need to. Her smile said everything. As she stepped outside, the light drizzle tapped gently against her coat, like a quiet ritual of cleansing, washing away the bitter years to make room for something new. A future where Julia Morgan, the woman who once stood, trembling in the shadows of the kitchen, would walk into the light. That night, as Julia unlocked her bicycle and pedaled slowly down the empty street, the cool wind threading through her hair, her heart beat fast. Not from fear, but from anticipation. For the first time in years, she felt her life was no longer closing in around her. For the first time, she believed she could become something more than hardship. And what she did not yet know was that this choice would change not only her life, but the lives of dozens of people in Riverbend, beginning from that very moment. All of it from a cup of spilled coffee and a man who chose to stand up. The next morning poured into Julia's small apartment, like a stranger who had never visited before, carrying a kind of warmth far brighter than the days she usually woke to the sound of overdue notices or the pounding of her own anxious heartbeat. Spencer was still asleep on his little bed, clutching the one-eyed teddy bear whose stuffing had long since shifted his breathing steady and peaceful, and Julia found herself standing there longer than usual, watching him. She had never allowed herself this pause to look at her son, not with the eyes of a mother struggling to survive, but of a mother beginning to believe she might finally give him something better. She brushed his hair gently, afraid to break the fragile peace of the moment, then turned away, her heart stirring with a feeling she could not yet name, a flutter of anticipation, as though she were about to step through the doorway of her own destiny. She opened the window, letting the breeze sweep in, carrying the scent of the Riverbend River and the rumble of morning trucks passing by. But today, even the familiar sound seemed different, as if the future had a new tone. When Julia reached Riverbend Grill, the air was still cool, but the soft sunlight spilled across the dusty windows, as if urging the place to wake with her. Dan was already there, coffee in hand, leaning against his old pickup truck. He was not wearing the button-down shirt from the previous night, but a grey hoodie and jeans, and somehow that simplicity made Julia feel strangely safe. "You are right on time," Dan said with a brief smile. "I always am," Julia replied, both proud and shy at the compliment. Dan handed her a hot cup of coffee. "Ready to begin." When Julia held the cup, its warmth spread through her fingers and into her chest, as if someone were telling her, "You deserve this." They walked into the diner without turning on the lights, letting the natural sunlight filter through the old window panes. Dan opened his bag, took out a laptop and several folders. Julia sat across from him, clasping her hands in her lap, as though afraid of touching something too big. First, Dan said, "I want to hear everything from your perspective. Not reports, not staffing notes. I want to hear Julia's Riverbend Grill." Julia inhaled deeply. Speaking the truth about the place she had worked for 8 months was not easy, but she had chosen to rise, and rising meant honesty. "This place is dying," Julia said plainly, and Dan looked up at her with respect. "Tony is overworked. The 2 night shift employees are always late. The morning shift is exhausted because there are not enough people. The kitchen runs fast one day and slow the next because there is no real system." And Julia bit her lip. Frank is not the only one who treats employees like garbage. Dan nodded and wrote every word, missing nothing. "What about customers?" he asked. Julia scanned the room, the space where she once trembled every time someone called out to her. "They come because they have no other option in town. They do not come because they love the place anymore." That sentence landed like a blade, cutting through the truth. Dan was silent for a long moment. "And you?" he asked softly. Julia blinked. "May, how do you feel walking in here every day?" Julia lowered her head, twisting her fingers into the edge of the tablecloth. "I feel like I am trying to hold on to something that is falling." Dan watched her, his gaze deep but warm. "Then we will not let it fall anymore." He opened his laptop and turned the screen toward her. "This is the restructuring plan." Julia saw a list of items appear: redesigning the space, rebuilding the menu structure, staff training, revising the tipping system, creating a community fund, launching programs to support struggling families in town, and finally, a line that made her heart thump. General Manager Transition Program, 6 months. Julia looked up at Dan, her eyes wide. 6 months. I have never led anyone. "You have been leading with your heart for a long time," Dan said. "Now you will learn the skills to guide with that heart." Julia touched the screen gently, afraid that pulling her hand back would make the shining future disappear. "Why choose me? You could hire anyone," Dan answered instantly. "No, I can hire skills, but I cannot hire kindness." His words made Julia feel as if she were breaking and being rebuilt at the same time. She remembered late nights wiping tables while swallowing tears, the times she forced a smile after being insulted, the moments she fought to stay standing when she felt like collapsing. And now someone was telling her those scars were not failures, but reasons to lift her up. Dan handed her a small notebook. From now on, this is your observation journal. A general manager has to listen and observe. Write down everything you notice, everything that bothers you, everything that needs fixing. Julia nodded. And I will teach you the rest, Dan said firmly. No pressure, no rushing, only partnership. Julia opened the notebook, her fingertip brushing across the blank page. For the first time, the blankness did not scare her. It was not emptiness. It was possibility. She wrote the first line, "The first day of my new life." Dan smiled when he saw her writing. He stood and walked to the window, pulling the curtains wide to let sunlight flood the space. The light touched every table, every chair, every worn wall, and finally rested on Julia's face. "Do you see it?" Dan asked. "This place can be beautiful." Julia nodded softly. But the most beautiful thing now was the feeling blooming inside her, a feeling she had not allowed herself for many years. Hope. When she stood closing the notebook gently in her hands, Julia knew one thing for certain. Today was not just her first lesson. It was the first morning of a different life. And even though she did not know how it would unfold, she knew one thing: she was no longer walking alone. Riverbend Grill was no longer a place she had to endure. It was becoming a place she belonged. And Julia Morgan, the woman who once feared even breathing too loudly, had finally begun learning how to stand tall, step forward, and reach for what she deserved. Her life and the future of the small town of Riverbend was truly beginning to change color. The first morning of her new journey passed faster than Julia expected, but that afternoon was what truly opened a chapter that made her both afraid and excited, as if her heart were running a few beats ahead of her body. Dan spent the entire day teaching her how to look at a restaurant through the eyes of a leader, not only seeing what was broken, but seeing what could become better. Julia sat beside him, writing down every word in her new notebook like a diligent student. But the more she wrote, the more she realized she was changing. Dan pointed toward the corner of the diner, where several shaky chairs had been propped up with folded paper beneath their legs. "This is the sign of neglect," he said, "but it is also a chance to show customers that we respect them." Julia nodded, then pointed toward the entrance where the old mat was fraying at the edges. And this is what makes customers feel like they do not deserve a better welcome. Dan looked at her with a surprising, delighted expression. "You understand faster than I expected." Julia felt her face warm, partly from embarrassment, partly from a pride she had not felt in years. By mid-afternoon, Tony walked in just as Julia was reviewing the staff list. His apron was stained with oil as usual, but his expression was different, as if he had just witnessed a small miracle. "Julia," Tony said, clearing his throat, "there is something I need to say." Julia turned, sensing something important. Tony rested his hand on the counter, his expression unusually serious. "Are you sure you want to do this? I have seen people hope too much and end up disappointed. I do not want this place to crush you." Julia looked at the grey-haired man who had quietly stood beside her for 8 months, and for the first time, she did not feel like a burden. "Life has crushed me before, Tony," she said softly. "But this time I am standing because I choose to stand, not because I have no other choice." Tony looked at her for a long moment, then smiled the smile of someone witnessing a seed finally breaking through the soil. "Then I am on your side." He handed her a small box bound by a rubber band. "I kept this for your mother years ago. She worked here before I bought the place. You should have it." Julia opened the box, and when she saw the small bronze badge engraved with the words, "Head Server, 1999, she pressed a hand over her mouth to hold back a sob. "My mother wore this every day," Julia whispered, eyes blurring. Tony nodded. She was proud of it. "I think you should be proud of yourself too." Julia held the box against her chest, feeling as if a part of her mother's spirit had returned to stand beside her, quiet and warm. The afternoon continued as Dan taught her how to observe customer flow, how to read revenue sheets, how to coordinate staff. He spoke, she wrote. He explained, she understood. She asked, he answered with a patience so steady it startled her, for Julia had never had someone be patient with her like this. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops of the small riverbend town, Dan closed his laptop. "Let's step outside for a moment," he said. "There is something I want you to see." Julia did not understand, but she nodded. They walked out into the street, the evening breeze lifting her hair and carrying the scent of damp wood and the river from the docks. Dan led her to an empty lot behind Riverbend Grill. There was nothing there but an old wall and patches of wild grass. Julia frowned. "What is this?" Dan stood in the middle of the lot, turning slowly, with his arms slightly open, as if presenting a stage set for a brand new story. "The back lot of the diner," he said. "Do you see anything?" Julia looked again, seeing only a forgotten corner of town. I'm not sure," Dan smiled. "Do you know why I chose to buy Riverbend Grill? Not just because it has potential. Because this town has something most places do not." Julia blinked, waiting for him to continue. "Riverbend has heart," Dan said gently. "People here still care about each other. They just need a place where that care can grow again." He turned to her, his gaze cutting through everything she had never dared imagine. "And I want this place right here to become a community garden. A place where children plant vegetables, where the elderly drink tea, where families gather. Part of the restaurant, but also part of the town." Julia's mouth fell open slightly as she tried to picture it. It felt strange, but the more she imagined it, the more beautiful it became. "Do you see?" Dan asked. "You will not only be a manager, you will help rebuild something for the whole community." Julia placed her hand on the rough wall, feeling as if she were touching a future that had not yet taken shape, but was already beating beneath the old bricks. I want to do this," she said, her voice filled with a new kind of determination. "Not for me, for Spencer, and for this town." Dan looked at her as though he had expected that answer all along. "Julia," he said, "last night you thought you were the one being saved. But the truth is," he paused, his voice warming, "you are the one who will save Riverbend Grill." Julia stood there in that empty lot with the evening birds calling and the distant hum of the river blending together, and for the first time in her life, the future didn't look like a dark tunnel filled with bills and late shifts. The future had shape, had color, had hope, and when Dan turned back and held out his hand, she took it without hesitation. In that moment, Julia understood that her worst days were no longer ahead of her. They were behind her, and the new road had just opened beneath her feet. And though she did not yet know how far she would go, she knew one thing for certain: she would not turn back. Because for the first time in many years, Julia Morgan was walking toward what she deserved, and the entire town of Riverbend would walk with her The next day was not only the day Julia began her training journey, but also the day she realized that every great change in life starts with the smallest things. A thank you, a smile, a chair straightened properly, a corner of the diner wiped more carefully than usual. When Julia opened the door of Riverbend Grill that morning, the smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the first sunlight made the entire space feel awake. She looked around and realized this was the first time she felt like she was stepping into a place she belonged to, not a place she endured just to survive. Dan had been there for a while, holding a task list marked with symbols Julia had not yet learned to read yet. Instead of pressure, she felt possibility. Today, Dan said with a voice both serious and excited, "We begin by seeing everything with the eyes of a leader." Julia nodded, her heart still fluttering. Dan handed her 2 sheets of paper. One was an evaluation checklist, the other his notes from 3 weeks of observation. "Come with me," he said, guiding her around the diner as if they were exploring a new land. At each spot, he asked for her impressions. At the register counter, Julia spoke immediately. "This machine runs slow. Customers wait too long and everyone gets irritated." Dan wrote it down. At tables 6 and 7, she added, "People like sitting by the window, but the curtain gets stuck so the sun shines directly on them in the afternoon. Many have complained." Dan continued noting every detail. When they reached the kitchen, Julia stopped. Not because it was dirty or messy, but because this was the place where she had cried so many times. "There is no place here for employees to rest," Julia said, her voice trembling slightly. "Long shifts and nowhere to lay down for even a moment. I used to." She stopped, swallowing hard. Dan did not push. He simply wrote, listening with quiet respect. Then he said, "We will change that." In that instant, Julia felt as if a pile of rubble inside her was being cleared away, making room for a new foundation. Back in the dining area, Dan gave her the first real challenge. "Julia, choose the 3 most important things you want to change first." Julia looked around, her heart racing. This was the first time anyone had ever asked what she wanted to change, the first time her voice carried weight. She took a deep breath and said, "First, create a rest space for the staff. Second, fix the window seating so customers feel valued. Third," her eyes moved toward the kitchen doorway where she had once cried, silently hiding from everyone, "rebuild the way employees are treated here. No one deserves to be yelled at or humiliated in front of customers." Dan looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "Julia, you just chose the heart of the restaurant." He stepped closer, as if to make sure she felt the weight of what she had done. "From now on, you are not just an employee. You are shaping the future of Riverbend Grill." The words thundered through her chest like someone pounding on a long, locked door inside her soul. She felt stronger, not because Dan said she was strong, but because she was beginning to believe she could be. That noon, the staff started arriving. They looked at Dan with curiosity, and at Julia with surprise. No one knew exactly what was happening, but everyone felt the shift in the air like a fresh wind entering a long-shut room. Dan let Julia speak. "I want everyone to know that starting today, Riverbend Grill will change," Julia said, her voice trembling but clear. "We will work in a better environment. No yelling, no mistreatment. Everyone will have a voice in how this place runs." The staff glanced at one another, some eyebrows raised in disbelief, but most eyes filled with hope. Tony stood behind the counter, nodding repeatedly, as if cheering her on silently. Dan remained in the corner, not stepping in, letting Julia take her place on the stage of her own life. When she finished speaking, Julia could barely breathe from nerves. But then, unexpectedly, Emily, the 19-year-old server who had only worked there for 2 months, started clapping. Her applause spread to a second person, then a third. Soon the entire staff was clapping the sound, echoing through the diner like a collective affirmation. They were ready to follow her. Julia bowed her head as tears spilled down her cheeks, this time from joy. That afternoon, Dan brought Julia to a meeting with the interior designer in charge of renovating the restaurant. Julia had never imagined that she, someone who once could not afford to pay her bills, would sit in a meeting where her opinion mattered like someone with authority. When choosing furniture styles, Dan asked Julia, "Which design do you like?" She let out a small, startled laugh. "I have never imagined I would get to choose anything for a restaurant." Dan looked at her warmly. "You have spent too much of your life without choices. Today, you get to choose." Julia touched a light oak sample, feeling as though she was touching a better version of herself, one she had never dared dream of. Everything felt like a dream too real to be imagined. That evening when she returned home, Spencer ran to hug her legs. "Mum, were you happy today?" Julia knelt down and hugged him, laughing through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart. Mummy is happy because today I started something new." "What is it, Mum?" Julia looked at him with a hope she had never carried before. "Something that might make life better for me. And for you." Spencer grinned, pure and warm like the first morning sunlight. Julia looked at her son and knew that every challenge ahead would be worth it. Because for the first time in many years, she was no longer living just to survive. She was living to build. Not just for herself, but for the child holding her leg and for the small town of Riverbend waiting for its light to return. And what she didn't yet know was that in just a few weeks, she, Julia Morgan, would become that light. The following weeks of rebuilding Riverbend Grill unfolded like a strong wind, sweeping through a town that had been asleep for far too long, and Julia stood at the center of it, no longer the woman who hid in the kitchen crying after being insulted, but the one leading with a notebook always filled with bullet points, plans, and hope. Every day, Julia arrived earlier than everyone else, opening the diner before the sun climbed over the eastern rooftops, wiping each table, straightening every chair, and adding new lines to her notebook. She wrote down the new laughter. She heard the glances that no longer carried fear, the employees who were beginning to believe they deserved respect. And strangely enough, the moment one person changed, the entire atmosphere shifted with them. Dan watched Julia work with barely concealed pride. He let her lead staff meetings on her own, give instructions on her own handle, small conflicts on her own. For the first time, Julia stood in front of the team, her voice still trembling, but her eyes steady, and said, "We are not just working in a restaurant. We are building something better together." Her words rippled outward like waves. Emily began smiling more. Luke, the night shift worker who was often late, started coming early and even helped Julia set up the window seating area without being asked. Tony, who had carried the weight of this place for years, looked almost younger as he watched Julia stand in the position he had always known she deserved. But the moment that touched Julia most was something incredibly small. A customer smiled when walking in. Not a polite smile, a real one, as if they sensed that something had changed here, something warm that Riverbend Grill had lost long ago. The day Dan brought in the renovation design board, Julia stood frozen by the wall, her hands shaking as she saw a sketch with the words, "Ideation" by Julia Morgan. She could not believe her eyes. Dan stood beside her and whispered, "Your name belongs there." And in that moment, Julia understood she was no longer a tiny piece of this place, she was its heart. When the construction crew started replacing doors and painting walls and relaying floors, Julia worked beside them, unafraid of getting paint on her hands, unafraid of carrying boxes, unafraid to learn how to read blueprints, until even the workers looked at her with genuine respect. One afternoon, while reorganizing the storage room, Julia found an old box filled with scattered photographs, former employees smiling a younger Tony, and her mother standing by the counter, wearing the same bronze badge Tony had given her. She sat on the floor, tears spilling for a reason that was not sadness, but the feeling that she was continuing the path her mother once dreamed of, but never had the chance to finish. When Dan walked in and saw her holding the photos, he sat beside her in silence, giving her space. After a long moment, he said quietly, "When your mother worked here, no one gave her a chance. She passed that strength to you, and now you are passing it to the entire town." Julia nodded, her smile, trembling but radiant. That night, as Julia stood in front of the diner's newly installed glass door, the warm yellow lights reflecting her silhouette, like a completely different version of herself, stronger, more confident, and larger than the pain that once consumed her, she placed her hand on the cool glass and felt warmth rising in her chest. And she knew this was only the beginning. Because for the first time, Julia Morgan understood that she was not just rebuilding a restaurant. She was rebuilding her life, brick by brick, choice by choice. And every step she took, no matter how small, was a step that made the entire town of Riverbend begin to believe in the miracle that was coming. The day the restaurant reopened after the renovation arrived sooner than Julia expected, yet it came exactly when the town of Riverbend needed something to ignite hope again. Before the grand opening, Julia stood in the renewed space, the light oak tables giving off a warm glow, the carefully chosen golden lights softening everything, and the sign, "Julia's Table." A place for community hanging at the entrance, tightening her chest with emotion. This was not just a name. It was a promise, a milestone proof that the woman who once stood humiliated in the middle of the diner was now its very soul. The staff lined up, waiting for the opening hour, each wearing new uniforms, their faces glowing as if they too had stepped into a new life. Tony stood beside her, the familiar scent of oil still clinging to his apron, but his eyes were filled with pride. "You did it, Julia," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "You brought new life to all of us." Julia squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of someone who had witnessed every tear and every moment she had gritted her teeth and endured. "No," Julia whispered. "We did it." When the clock struck 10, Julia took a deep breath and opened the door. The first customers walked in, and Julia saw familiar faces from Riverbend old Mrs. Rose, who always sat at table number 3 every Sunday, the Mitchell family with their 3 loud children, the elderly police officer who hated change, and even strangers curious about the good news spreading for the past 2 weeks. They looked around, eyes wide, mouths forming little wows Julia never imagined she would hear. But what struck her most was not the compliments. It was when Mrs. Rose stepped forward and hugged her, her hands shaky but firm. "Julia, you turned this place into a home," she said, her voice raspy with emotion. Another family approached the mother, saying, I heard you created a meal program for those struggling. Thank you. Not many people dare to do that." Julia choked her smile, trembling, as warm tears ran down her cheeks. Dan stood behind her, leaning against the counter, watching her with the expression of someone who knew he had placed his trust exactly where it belonged. The crowd grew and grew, every tableful laughter, filling the dining room compliments, spreading from corner to corner, and the smell of hot food making the space feel alive, like a beating heart. Julia ran the floor, not to hide fear, as she once did, but to welcome, connect, and lead. She assigned Emily to the large table, guided Luke on how to handle difficult customers without losing calm, and reminded Tony to adjust the soup to match local taste. Everything flowed so smoothly that even Julia felt as if she were dreaming. Near the end of lunch, as the crowd began thinning, Dan approached the table where Julia was sorting receipts. "Look," he said softly, and Julia lifted her head. Groups of customers lingered longer. Many purchased extra meals to support the charity program. Several asked when the community garden would be finished, and children ran around the new mural, reading the words, "Julia's Table," with an excitement she never imagined would be tied to her name. "You made that happen?" Dan said warmly. "Not me." Julia shook her head, but Dan leaned closer, his tone firm and full of pride. "I only opened the door. You were the one who walked through it." Julia held her coffee cup, gazing at the scene before her, customers, chatting happily, staff, working without tension, laughter blending with the gentle clatter of pans in the kitchen. Everything felt like something she once believed existed only in the dreams of others. She looked at Dan, her lips trembling. "I never thought I could do this." "That is because no one ever gave you the chance to think," so Dan replied. "But you proved yourself worthy." Julia opened her mouth to answer, but her voice caught when Spencer rushed in from the back door, holding a small bunch of wildflowers. "Mum, I put flowers on all the tables," he said proudly. Julia gathered him into her arms, and in that moment she knew that every struggle she had endured had led her to this day, the day she could give her son something she had never had someone to be proud of. That afternoon, as Julia stood outside on the porch, looking toward the long road passing through the quiet neighborhood, where the sunlight was softening into something tender, she realized that her life had changed forever. No longer the woman overlooked, no longer the woman drained of her kindness, no longer the shadow in the kitchen. Julia Morgan had stepped into the light, and as she rose, the entire town transformed with her. Dan stepped beside her and handed her a cup of coffee. "You know what the best part of today is?" he asked. Julia smiled. "What is it?" "Everyone walked out of here feeling like they belong," Dan said. "And that is because of you." Julia looked back at the restaurant, the tables covered in flowers, the staff laughing together, the customers slowly leaving, but not wanting the moment to end. And she knew Dan was right. But something even more true rose quietly in her heart. For the first time in her life, Julia felt she belonged to the very place she had rebuilt with her own hands. One person being seen had illuminated an entire community, and this was only the beginning. From the perspective of a specialist in organizational culture and community revitalization, Julia Morgan's story reveals an essential truth. Sustainable change does not begin with budgets, plans, or technology. It begins with people. When one individual is truly seen and given the right opportunity at the right moment, they do more than change their own life. They create a ripple effect that heals the entire ecosystem around them. Riverbend Grill didn't come back to life because of Dan Hayes's money, but because of the qualities within Julia, her kindness, her resilience, and her ability to lead with her heart. Any organization or community can transform when people like her are empowered to shine. If you believe that a single person can spark meaningful change, hit like and subscribe to follow more inspiring stories like this. And do not forget to leave a comment with the phrase, "Thay now," so we can carry Julia's spirit even farther.